Spring 1944. Normandy's hedgerows concealed something Wehrmacht panzer crews couldn't comprehend. Soldiers who killed tanks without warning. No rocket flare, no telltale backblast, just sudden catastrophic detonation that turned Panther armor into coffins. German after-action reports described attacks by ghost weapons that struck from impossible ranges. Intelligence officers dismissed early claims as combat fatigue until the pattern became undeniable. What British engineers designed but struggled to master, Canadian infantrymen transformed into the most feared close assault weapon of the European theatre. This is how farm boys from Saskatchewan and miners from Nova Scotia turned a weapon their own army doubted into de Lotlos Todd, the Silent Death. February 1943, the War Office Armaments Testing Facility, Shoeburyness, Essex. 0847 hours. Rain drummed against corrugated tin roofs as Major Geoffrey Blacker watched his 10th test. Firing of the PIAT failed spectacularly. The spring-powered Spigot mortar, officially designated Projector Infantry Anti-Tank Mark I, had just misfired for the third consecutive attempt. Spent cordite hung in the damp air. Temperature 4 degrees Celsius. Conditions miserable. Results worse. The weapon represented 18 months of desperate innovation born from Dunkirk's bitter lessons. When Britain's army abandoned 600 tanks and 75,000 vehicles on French beaches in 1940, military planners confronted an existential problem. German panzer divisions possessed overwhelming armoured superiority, and British infantry had virtually nothing to stop them. The Boy's anti-tank rifle proved worthless against newer German armour. American bazookas wouldn't arrive for months. British factories needed an indigenous solution immediately. Blacker's design emerged from this desperation. A shoulder-fired weapon using a massive spring to launch a 3-pound hollow-charge bomb capable of penetrating 75 meters of armour at 100 yards. No propellant gases, no backblast signature, theoretically perfect for close-quarters ambush. The engineering was brilliant, the practical reality was brutal. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Shaw, Canadian Army liaison officer, stood beside Blacker watching the demonstration with characteristic prairie stoicism. Shaw had requested assignment to British weapons trials, specifically to evaluate equipment for Canadian divisions preparing for continental invasion. Born in Medicine Hat, Alberta, 37 years old, Shaw possessed the methodical patience of a man who'd spent childhood winters repairing farm machinery at -30 temperatures. He saw immediately what British officers missed. "Spring's not the problem," Shaw said quietly, examining the weapon's cocking mechanism. "Operators don't understand the physics. They're fighting the weapon instead of working with it." Blacker turned, irritated. "The spring requires 90 pounds of force to cock. Our trials show soldiers simply can't manage it reliably under combat stress." Shaw hefted the PIAT, feeling its crude weight, 32 pounds of welded steel tube, spring assembly, and improvised mounting. British Army testing protocols emphasized individual operation by soldiers, with average physical conditioning following standard training. Results showed 40% misfire rates during field exercises. Units rejected the weapon as impractical. Production continued anyway because alternatives didn't exist, but enthusiasm was non-existent. "Permission to take 6 PIATs back to Canadian training facilities, sir," Shaw requested formally. "I'd like our chaps to evaluate them under operational conditions." Blacker gestured toward the racks of weapons gathering dust. "Take 12. Frankly, Colonel, I don't expect you'll have better luck. The weapon's design is fundamentally sound, but human factors make it unreliable. Perhaps Canadians will find some limited application, but don't expect miracles." March 1943. Canadian Army Training Centre, Aldershot, Hampshire. Shaw arrived with his PIATs and unconventional ideas that contradicted British doctrine entirely. He selected soldiers not from elite units, but from backgrounds that suggested mechanical aptitude combined with stubborn determination. Saskatchewan farmers accustomed to coaxing frozen machinery to life, Ontario factory workers skilled at improvisation, Quebecois lumberjacks whose work demanded strength applied intelligently rather than brutally. Sergeant Thomas Mackay, formerly of Swift Current, Saskatchewan, aged 24, became Shaw's primary test subject. Mackay had spent teenage years maintaining combine harvesters and tractors with whatever parts could be salvaged or fabricated. His approach to the PIAT reflected that background. Instead of fighting the cocking mechanism, he studied its geometry until understanding replaced frustration. "It's leverage, sir," Mackay explained during the third day of trials, demonstrating technique that seemed impossible. "You don't pull straight back. You use body weight. Angle the weapon, let physics do the work. Like hand-cranking a stubborn engine in January. Force alone won't do it, but understanding the machine will." Shaw watched Mackay cock and fire the PIAT 6 consecutive times without failure. Each shot landed within 5 feet of aim point at 80 yards, far exceeding British testing results. The difference wasn't physical strength, it was methodology born from culture that celebrated practical problem-solving over rigid adherence to manual instructions. By April 1943, Shaw's experimental platoon achieved 92% first-shot reliability with PIATs under field conditions including rain, mud, and simulated combat stress. They developed techniques for rapid reloading, camouflaged firing positions, exploiting the weapon's lack of backblast, and tactics for engaging armor at ranges British doctrine considered impossible. News spread quietly through Canadian divisions. The weapon everyone else hated actually worked, if you understood it properly. The transformation occurred because Canadian training philosophy differed fundamentally from British approaches. Where British doctrine emphasized standardization and procedure, Canadian training encouraged adaptation and initiative. Farm boys who'd improvised solutions their entire lives applied that same creativity to military equipment. The PIAT wasn't a problem to be endured. It was a tool to be mastered through understanding rather than mere repetition. April 1943. Shaw submitted detailed reports to Canadian Army headquarters recommending widespread PIAT adoption with specialized training protocols. His conclusions challenged British testing entirely. The weapon's perceived unreliability stems from inappropriate training methodology rather than design deficiency. Canadian soldiers demonstrate conclusively that proper technique transforms the PIAT into a highly effective anti-armor system. Recommend immediate integration into infantry training with emphasis on mechanical understanding rather than procedural compliance. Headquarters approved cautiously. By September 1943, 4,000 Canadian infantrymen had completed Shaw's training program. They would carry PIATs ashore at Normandy 9 months later, armed with skills Wehrmacht panzer crews had never encountered and couldn't comprehend. June 7, 1944. D-Day +1. The Bocage country south of Juno Beach, Normandy. 14:35 hours. Corporal James Henderson of the Regina Rifle Regiment crouched in a drainage ditch, choked with nettles and mud. PIAT cradled across his knees, watching a Panzer IV maneuver 90 yards distant through the narrow lane bordered by ancient hedgerows. Temperature, 18 degrees Celsius. Sky, overcast. Hedgerows, 12-foot-high earthen banks topped with centuries-old hawthorn, creating natural fortifications the Germans exploited brilliantly. Tactical situation, catastrophic. Henderson's platoon had advanced 800 yards inland before encountering what every Allied planner feared. German armor operating in terrain that nullified Allied air superiority and artillery advantage. The Bocage transformed Normandy into a labyrinth of narrow lanes, sunken roads, and small fields enclosed by impenetrable hedgerows. Perfect defensive terrain where single tanks could dominate entire sectors. Allied tank infantry coordination broke down completely in the maze. Infantry found themselves isolated, vulnerable, facing armor they couldn't flank or escape. British and American units suffered appalling casualties in the first days. German panzers appeared without warning, fired point-blank into infantry columns trapped in confined lanes, then disappeared before Allied armor could respond. After-action reports described helpless slaughter, infantry pinned against hedgerows, unable to maneuver, cut down by machine gun fire or crushed by tracks. American bazookas required clear firing lines that didn't exist in the bocage. British doctrine relied on coordinated tank infantry assault that terrain made impossible. The hedgerows became killing grounds. Canadian infantry discovered something different. The PIAT's design characteristics that made it awkward in open terrain became devastating advantages in bocage warfare. No backblast meant soldiers could fire from enclosed positions without revealing location. The weapon's arc trajectory allowed shots over hedgerows or at extreme angles impossible for direct-fire weapons. Most critically, its silence meant German crews received no warning before catastrophic impact. Henderson had learned PIAT operation from Sergeant Mackay himself during training at Aldershot. He understood intuitively what British soldiers struggled to accept. The weapon required patience, positioning, and mechanical sympathy rather than aggressive assault. He'd spent childhood summers on his father's dairy farm near Regina, where machinery that failed meant catastrophe and improvisation meant survival. That background informed every decision now. The Panzer IV commander wasn't expecting threats from infantry that should have been suppressed or eliminated. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine assumed Allied infantry without tank support posed minimal danger to armor. German crews had learned through 2 years of Eastern Front combat that infantry caught in close terrain could be slaughtered with impunity. Soviet anti-tank rifles proved ineffective against improved armor. American bazookas announced their position with backblast visible from 200 yards. Wehrmacht tankers approached Normandy's bocage with confidence bordering on arrogance. Henderson waited. PIAT already cocked. He'd prepared the weapon 20 minutes earlier, knowing spring tension could be maintained indefinitely, unlike chemical propellants that degraded. The tank moved slowly, commander's hatch open, scanning for conventional threats. Opposing armor, anti-tank guns, obvious ambush positions. Henderson lay motionless in vegetation that concealed him completely. Distance, 85 yards, nearly point-blank for bocage fighting. Angle, 45 degrees off the tank's frontal arc, presenting thinner side armor. Target, junction between turret and hull, where 3-pound hollow charge warhead would penetrate into crew compartment. He exhaled slowly, settled the weapon's crude shoulder pad, and squeezed the trigger mechanism. The PIAT fired with its characteristic dull thump, not silent, but compared to any other anti-tank weapon, eerily muted. The bomb arced slightly, covering 85 yards in 2 seconds. No smoke trail, no visible signature. The hollow charge warhead struck exactly where Henderson aimed. Shaped charge, penetrated armor, superheated jet of molten metal and explosive gas tore through the fighting compartment, detonating stored ammunition. The Panzer IV exploded internally, turret lifting, flames erupting from hatches, crew killed instantly. Total time from firing to detonation, 2.1 seconds. The German commander never saw what killed him. Henderson was already moving, following training that emphasized immediate relocation after firing. Remaining in position meant death if supporting German infantry responded. He rolled left, crawled 15 yards through nettles that tore exposed skin, reached secondary position prepared earlier. The hedgerow erupted with German machine gun fire, suppressive shooting at where Henderson had been, not where he was now. By the time German infantry cautiously approached the firing position, Henderson had disappeared into bocage maze that concealed and protected him. This pattern repeated across Canadian sector throughout June and July 1944. German after-action reports began noting disturbing trend. Panzer losses to unknown weapon systems that struck without warning from unexpected angles at ranges exceeding typical infantry anti-tank capabilities. Wehrmacht intelligence struggled to explain casualties that didn't match any weapon profile they recognized. Tanks destroyed showed penetration damage consistent with hollow-charge weapons, but tactical circumstances contradicted all known Allied anti-tank systems. German survivors described attacks that seemed impossible. No rocket signature, no gun flash, no telltale backblast, just sudden lethal detonation from concealed positions. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine had no counter for threats they couldn't detect before engagement. Panzer crews began closing commander hatches even in supposedly secure areas, dramatically reducing situational awareness but reflecting genuine fear of invisible enemy. By late June, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division's war diary recorded 47 confirmed panzer kills attributed to PIAT teams, extraordinary numbers for shoulder-fired weapons. The Canadian approach succeeded because it abandoned conventional anti-tank tactics entirely. British and American doctrine treated anti-tank weapons as defensive, fighting withdrawal systems. Canadians employed PIATs offensively, infiltrating into bocage, establishing ambush positions, waiting with agricultural patience for targets to enter kill zones they'd carefully prepared. The psychological impact proved as valuable as tactical success. Wehrmacht panzer units operating in Canadian sector reported morale deterioration as crews recognized they faced threats their training hadn't prepared them to counter. The silent, invisible attacks violated fundamental assumptions about infantry armor engagement. German tactical confidence, built through years of Eastern Front victories, eroded quickly when advantages disappeared and death arrived without warning. Canadian PIAT teams developed dark pride in their effectiveness. They gave their weapon nicknames, reflecting grim respect: the Hammer, the Reaper, the ugly bastard that works. They shared techniques informally: how to identify firing positions, how to judge range in confined terrain, how to predict panzer movement through narrow lanes. This knowledge transfer happened organically, soldiers teaching soldiers, building collective expertise that formal training couldn't replicate. By July 1944, Canadian Army intelligence intercepted German communications, referring to Lautlos Panzerabwehrwaffe, silent anti-tank weapon, and Geisterangriff, ghost attacks. Wehrmacht commanders issued tactical bulletins warning of new Allied close assault capability requiring extreme caution in confined terrain. Panzer crews began calling the invisible threat Der Lautlose Tod, the silent death. They feared what they couldn't see, couldn't predict, couldn't counter effectively. That fear proved as valuable as the actual tank kills. July 18, 1944. Wehrmacht 12th SS Panzer Division Headquarters, Pontigny, Normandy. ZU, 9:20 hours. Sturmbannführer Helmut Fischer studied casualty reports that contradicted everything his Eastern Front experience taught him about armored warfare. Temperature, 22 degrees Celsius. Conditions, dry, excellent visibility. Tactical situation, incomprehensible. His division had lost 23 Panther and Panzer IV tanks in 12 days, not to Allied armor or anti-tank guns, but to Canadian infantry using weapons German intelligence couldn't identify or counter. Fischer commanded the division's Panzer Regiment, veteran of Kursk and Kharkov, where he'd learned that infantry without heavy weapons posed minimal threat to properly deployed armor. Wehrmacht doctrine established clear hierarchy. Tanks dominated infantry, anti-tank guns countered tanks at range. Close assault required specialized engineer units with satchel charges who could be suppressed with machine gun fire. This hierarchy had governed Eastern Front combat successfully for 3 years. It wasn't working in Normandy. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. Tanks operating in bocage encountered sudden catastrophic attacks from positions German commanders thought secure. No warning signatures, no visible weapon flash, just immediate, lethal penetration from angles that seemed impossible for direct-fire weapons. Surviving crew members, when there were survivors, reported no indication of threat before impact. Some described hearing dull thump immediately before detonation. but attributed this to imagination or post-traumatic confusion. German tactical intelligence operated through methodical analysis, identify weapon system, determine capabilities and limitations, develop countermeasures, disseminate throughout Wehrmacht. This process had worked effectively against Soviet, British and American weapons. Against the Canadian silent weapon, it failed completely because fundamental assumptions proved incorrect. Intelligence officers initially theorized Canadians deployed new American weapon system not yet catalogued. Analysis teams examined destroyed tanks, recovered fragments, interviewed survivors. Findings contradicted theory. Warhead design matched British hollow charge technology, not American bazooka systems. But tactical employment, range, accuracy, lack of signature exceeded known British PIAT capabilities by significant margins. Reports sat in contradiction, unable to reconcile observed results with weapon specifications German intelligence possessed. Oberleutnant Hans Weber, Division Intelligence Officer, previously assigned to Waffenamt technical evaluation, recognized the warhead fragments. "It's the British spring gun," he informed Fischer during briefing on July 20th. PIAT. "We evaluated captured examples in 1943. Assessment concluded weapon was poorly designed, unreliable, ineffective beyond 50 yards. British units barely used them. We categorized them as minimal threat." Fischer stared at casualty lists that directly contradicted this assessment. "Either your 1943 evaluation was catastrophically wrong, or Canadians somehow improved the weapon significantly. Which is it?" Weber had no answer. German technical evaluation had been methodologically sound. Captured PIATs tested under controlled conditions, assessed by experienced weapons engineers, compared against Wehrmacht anti-tank capabilities. Conclusions seemed irrefutable. Weapons suffered from excessive cocking force requirements, poor accuracy, limited effective range, complex operation unsuited to combat stress. German testers fired PIATs, confirmed these deficiencies, classified the weapon as negligible threat. What they failed to test was whether soldiers with different training philosophy and mechanical background might overcome these limitations through technique rather than design modification. This conceptual blindness reflected deeper Wehrmacht cultural assumptions. German military doctrine emphasized precision engineering, standardized procedures, hierarchical command. Weapons were designed to specifications. Soldiers trained to operate them according to manual instructions. The notion that informal training methodology could transform weapon effectiveness contradicted German military philosophy fundamentally. If PIAT design was inherently flawed, and testing confirmed this, then no amount of training could overcome those flaws. German logic was impeccable. German logic was wrong. Canadian success stemmed from cultural approach Wehrmacht couldn't comprehend. Soldiers who treated weapons as tools requiring understanding rather than procedures requiring compliance. Saskatchewan farmers who'd coaxed life from frozen machinery didn't follow manuals. They developed intuitive mechanical sympathy through experimentation and adaptation. Applied to PIAT operation, this philosophy produced results that seemed impossible within German conceptual framework. Fischer faced tactical problem without solution. His panzers were being destroyed by infantry weapons his doctrine said shouldn't threaten them, using techniques his training said couldn't work. Wehrmacht tactical flexibility, considerable on Eastern Front against Soviet forces, proved inadequate against enemy whose operational approach contradicted German assumptions entirely. He issued tactical bulletins attempting to counter threat. Maintain maximum distance from hedgerows, avoid narrow lanes, suppress suspected infantry positions with machine gun fire before advancing, deploy infantry screens ahead of armor. These countermeasures proved marginally effective, but catastrophically inefficient. Maintaining distance from hedgerows meant abandoning tactical mobility that made bocage defensible. Suppressing every potential position consumed ammunition unsustainably. Infantry screens slowed advance to crawl, negating armor's primary advantage. speed and shock. Most critically, countermeasures assumed German crews could identify threats before engagement. Against PIAT teams who positioned carefully, remained concealed absolutely, and fired from unexpected angles with no visible signature, this assumption proved fatally optimistic. Canadian PIAT operators chose firing positions specifically to exploit German tactical responses, selecting angles where suppressive fire couldn't reach, waiting for moments when tank attention focused elsewhere, exploiting terrain that made preemptive suppression impossible. July 25, 1944. Fischer personally interviewed Unterscharführer Paul Richter, sole survivor of Panther crew destroyed 3 days earlier. Richter, age 21, from Stuttgart, 6 months combat experience, exhibited symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma. Difficulty maintaining eye contact, involuntary trembling, flat affect when describing engagement. "We were advancing through orchards south of Caen," Richter reported mechanically. Commander had clear visibility, no obvious threats. Infantry screen had swept the area 20 minutes prior. We were moving slowly, scanning for anti-tank positions. I was on bow machine gun, watching right sector. I heard nothing, no rocket, no gun, nothing. Just sudden impact, flash of light, burning. The commander and gunner died instantly. I got out through lower hatch. I don't know where it came from. I didn't see anything. Fischer recognized the symptoms. Combat-effective soldiers reduced to psychological wrecks by threat they couldn't identify, counter, or psychologically process. Eastern Front combat produced similar trauma from Soviet artillery or Katyusha rockets. Impersonal, random, unstoppable. But this was different. The weapon wasn't random. It was precisely targeted. It wasn't impersonal. It represented individual soldiers making deliberate choice to kill. The psychological impact came from helplessness. German training and equipment offered no protection against enemy who struck silently, invisibly, lethally. Wehrmacht panzer crews in Canadian sector began exhibiting reluctance to advance into terrain where bocage fighting was necessary. Experienced commanders who'd led assaults at Kursk now hesitated, double-checked orders, sought alternative routes. Tactical confidence, foundation of aggressive armored warfare, deteriorated as crews recognized their vulnerability and powerlessness. Doctrine that governed Eastern Front success proved inapplicable against enemy whose methods Wehrmacht couldn't predict or counter. By late July, 12th SS Panzer Division's operational effectiveness degraded significantly, not from material losses, though these were serious, but from psychological attrition. Crews entered combat expecting death from invisible sources. That expectation created hesitation, reduced initiative, transformed elite Panzer Division into cautious, defensive force. Canadian PIAT teams achieved tactical impact, far exceeding their numerical strength through psychological dominance that Wehrmacht tactical philosophy had no framework to address or overcome. Fischer's final report to Corps headquarters acknowledged failure explicitly. Canadian infantry demonstrate anti-tank capability we cannot effectively counter with current tactical doctrine. Recommend fundamental reassessment of infantry threat evaluation and development of new countermeasures specifically targeting this weapon system. Current approaches prove inadequate. The report circulated through Wehrmacht command but produced no practical solutions. German military machine that had conquered most of Europe couldn't solve problem presented by Canadian farm boys with spring-powered weapons and unorthodox training. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The PIAT's war diary closed with extraordinary statistics that military historians would debate for decades. Canadian forces recorded 347 confirmed armor kills attributed to PIAT teams between June 1944 and May 1945, numbers that exceeded many dedicated anti-tank gun batteries. Individual soldiers achieved legendary status. Sergeant Ernest Smith earned Victoria Cross for solo PIAT engagement, destroying 2 Panthers and covering battalion withdrawal. Private John Mackenzie, Regina Rifles, recorded 9 confirmed kills. Corporal Henderson survived the war with 6 destroyed panzers credited to his weapon, extraordinary survival rate for close assault infantry. The success statistics reveal deeper story than simple kill counts. Canadian PIAT effectiveness averaged 73% first-shot reliability under combat conditions, compared to 40% in British trials and 55% in American evaluations of similar weapons. This disparity stemmed not from Canadian physical superiority, but from training philosophy that emphasized mechanical understanding over procedural compliance. Saskatchewan farmers and Ontario factory workers approached military equipment with practical problem-solving mindset that military bureaucracies struggled to replicate systematically. When war ended, military analysts from Britain, United States, and Canada converged to study the PIAT phenomenon. Their conclusions challenged fundamental assumptions about weapons development and training methodology. British Army after-action analysis admitted candidly, "The weapon we designed but failed to employ effectively was mastered by colonial forces through training approaches we did not consider." This represents significant lessons about relationship between equipment design, user training, and combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Shaw, promoted to full colonel by war's end, authored comprehensive study on PIAT employment that became required reading at military staff colleges. His central thesis contradicted prevailing wisdom. Weapon effectiveness is determined as much by training methodology and user cultural background as by engineering specifications. The PIAT succeeded in Canadian hands, not because we modified the weapon, but because we modified how soldiers understood and operated it. Cultural factors emphasizing mechanical improvisation and practical problem-solving proved as valuable as any technical specification. This insight extended beyond PIAT to fundamental questions about military effectiveness. Why did some units excel with equipment others found inadequate? How did cultural background influence combat capability? Could agricultural or industrial experience translate to military effectiveness in measurable ways? Shaw's work suggested answers that made military planners uncomfortable. Standardization and procedural compliance might be less valuable than initiative and adaptive thinking. The psychological impact on Wehrmacht proved equally significant. Post-war interviews with German Panzer veterans revealed lasting trauma from bocage fighting that exceeded Eastern Front experiences. Sturmbannführer Fischer, captured May 1945, provided candid assessment. Eastern Front was brutal but comprehensible. You understood threats, developed counters, fought according to doctrine. Normandy was different. Canadians fought in ways our training didn't prepare for. The silent weapon represented something we couldn't counter, not because we lacked technology, but because their approach contradicted our tactical framework entirely. It was deeply demoralizing. This admission revealed something profound about Wehrmacht limitations. German military excellence stemmed from systematic doctrine, superior engineering, rigorous training within established frameworks. When facing adversaries who operated within similar frameworks, Soviet, British, American forces, following conventional doctrine, German advantages proved decisive. Against Canadians who ignored conventional framework and developed unorthodox methods through cultural adaptation, German's systematic approach failed. Doctrine that assumed all adversaries would fight logically and predictably couldn't counter enemy who improvised creatively. The individual stories behind statistics revealed human dimension of tactical success. Sergeant McKay returned to Swift Current, Saskatchewan, resumed farming, never spoke publicly about war service. He died in 1987. Local newspaper obituary mentioned military service briefly without detail. 3 generations of his family never knew he'd revolutionized anti-tank warfare through practical application of principles he'd learned maintaining farm equipment. This modesty characterized many Canadian PIAT operators, men who accomplished extraordinary feats, but saw themselves as simply doing their job competently. Corporal Henderson received military medal for actions in Normandy, returned to Regina after demobilization, worked dairy farm until retirement in 1976. In 1992, military historian conducting research on Canadian PIAT employment located Henderson, then 71, for interview. Henderson described his 6 tank kills matter-of-factly. It was just mechanics, really. Understand how the weapon works, position yourself properly, wait for right moment. Same principles as fixing machinery, just different application. This pragmatism reflected broader Canadian military culture that combined effectiveness with understatement. Where other nations celebrated individual heroism dramatically, Canadians emphasized collective competence and practical results. PIAT success stemmed from hundreds of soldiers applying methodical problem-solving to military challenges, not through dramatic individual actions, but through consistent, intelligent application of technique, refined through shared experience. The PIAT itself disappeared rapidly after war's end. New anti-tank weapons, American bazookas, British PIAT's successor designs, offered easier operation and greater range. By 1950, PIATs were relegated to reserve units and military museums. But tactical lessons persisted, the relationship between cultural background and military effectiveness, the value of adaptive thinking over rigid procedure, the potential for unorthodox training to transform weapon performance. Modern military education uses PIAT case study to illustrate principles about training methodology, cultural factors in combat effectiveness, and limitations of weapons testing that ignores human factors. Canadian success with weapon that British soldiers found inadequate demonstrates that equipment effectiveness depends on complex interaction between design, training, user background, and tactical employment. No amount of testing could have predicted that Saskatchewan farmers would transform PIAT into the most feared close assault weapon of the European theatre, because testing evaluated mechanical specifications rather than human potential. The legacy endures in unexpected ways. Canadian Forces training philosophy still emphasizes practical problem-solving and mechanical understanding over rigid procedural compliance. Weapons training incorporates principles Shaw developed. Teach soldiers why weapons work, not just how to operate them. Encourage adaptation rather than standardization. Recruit soldiers with backgrounds suggesting mechanical aptitude and creative thinking. These principles trace directly to lessons learned in Normandy bocage, where farm boys with spring-powered weapons defeated Wehrmacht's finest panzer divisions through intelligence, patience, and unorthodox thinking. Der lautlose Tod, the silent death, represented more than just effective weapon. It symbolized broader truth about military effectiveness, that cultural factors, training philosophy, and human creativity matter as much as engineering excellence, that unconventional approaches can overcome conventional superiority, that soldiers who understand their tools fundamentally will always outperform those who merely follow procedures. Wehrmacht tankers who faced Canadian PIAT teams learned this lesson too late. Their fear was rational recognition of facing adversary who'd mastered weapon they'd dismissed and employed it through methods they couldn't counter. That fear was the sound of doctrine failing against innovation, standardization losing to adaptation, and engineering excellence being defeated by agricultural common sense, applied with lethal effectiveness. The PIAT story reveals how ordinary soldiers achieved extraordinary results through innovation and determination, qualities that defined Canadian contributions to Allied victory. If you found this exploration of overlooked World War II history compelling, subscribe for more untold stories from the conflict that shaped our world. Share your thoughts in the comments. What other underappreciated weapons or tactics deserve recognition? Your engagement helps preserve these vital historical lessons for future generations.